Well, thank you everyone who is here live, fairly late on the second day of All Things Open. I see some of my colleagues out there. So I'm Gordon Haff. I work in emerging technology at Red Hat. I'm usually go by technology advocate or something like that. And among other things, I've written a book on how open source ate software, which kind of got me involved with some of our open source research at Red Hat and also some of the other kind of related IT trends research there. Used to be an industry analyst, which kind of interests me in this research stuff. Work with Red Hat, corporate marketing research, and brand insights research. And I'm going to share some of that today. I was supposed to be here with Kelly Andrews and our brand insights down in Raleigh, but unfortunately she couldn't make it. So I'm going to kind of take her part of kind of giving a very quick intro to research. I know some of you here are probably very familiar with the research process, but let me just give a bit of a recap and then we'll go on to the actual numbers. So quantitative research, which is what we're mostly going to be talking about here, you tend to have big samples, at least you hope you have big samples. Um, the nice thing about having quantitative research is you can track results and make forecasts based on those. So things are going up at about this rate. Maybe they'll continue to go up at about this rate. You have a structured questionnaire. You sit down in front, and I'm not going to get into all the mechanics of doing a structured questionnaire, but basically you have trees of questions that this person says um, they do this. Oh, maybe we'll ask them this branch of questions. If they, I don't know anything about edge computing, we're not going to ask them any details for edge computing. Mostly closed end, by which I mean multiple choice on a scale from 1 to 10, that kind of thing. Um, we can ask an open-ended question or, hey, is there anything else we didn't provide a multiple choice answer for? But people don't tend to fill those in, so not super useful. Can do statistics. One of the things about quantitative is it does assume a general knowledge of the survey space. So if we ask a multiple choice question, it kind of assumes that we know some reasonable choices to put there. We know enough about what people are thinking. We know enough about the types of answers they might be inclined to choose from. Qualitative, on the other hand, and for our purposes here, this mostly means focus groups. In at least at Red Hat, in terms of the kind of research I'm involved with, it usually means a focus group. Um, we also have other types of interviews and things like our customer advisory boards or customer advisory councils. You can think of that as a form of research as well. And it gives you an indication of kind of direction of results. It doesn't give you a number, but it gives you kind of direction that things are going in. Get dynamic discussion. People play off each other. Oh, yeah, you mentioned that there's this aspect of Linux which you're finding. Yeah, we're seeing that in our shop too. And we're also seeing this. So that's kind of open-ended and unstructured. The way these usually work is for kind of a formal focus group, and there's a picture in a few slides, but basically you'll have maybe 8, 10, usually fairly, well, it depends what kind of research you're doing, but you'll have 8 or 10 people that are pretty deeply familiar with the subject matter. In a room, there will be a professional facilitator in there. And then a bunch of us are going to be on the other side of a one-way mirror who's, or you call it two-way mirrors, whichever. We can see them, they can't see us in a room. And then what usually happens is there's been some questions agreed to beforehand. As the discussion goes on, the facilitator will come out and ask us questions a couple of times. What do you want us to add? What would you like me to probe deeper? And the idea here is that dealing with emotion, it's dealing with discovery. It's not telling us numbers, but it's kind of telling us, oh, they don't think this something is secure, but not at 56% said. Some examples, 67% of respondents bought ice cream today. Now, we could maybe dig down more on why that was the case if we had some theories, but maybe you have a focus group is, I got ice cream today because I saw it on sale near the checkout and felt like a treat. Maybe we wouldn't have thought of the near the checkout or the sale part, and okay, that's sort of interesting. Company has a net promoter score of 87%, it's actually a very high number. For those of you who don't know, net promoter score, NPS, that's basically, would you recommend this company to someone else? Qualitative, I wouldn't hesitate to recommend company because they're so socially responsible. Oh, we might not have thought to list that as a reason in a multiple choice because we didn't think people cared as much about that. And respondents rate this grocery store 4 out of 5 on average. Well, I like this grocery store overall, but there are a few things it could really do better. And again, I might not think to ask those things in a multiple choice question. And I think most of you are probably more familiar again with quantitative research. And does it have it in mobile these days that have a demographic breakdown? How do the following topics affect your likelihood of purchasing a new home? The one at the sort of upper middle, we blanked out the actual questions there, but this is some sort of, on a scale from 1 to 10, how effective are these different social media companies at, getting you to do X or providing this information to you? Where do you get your news from in a scale from 1 to 10, that kind of thing. Upper right is unfortunately how we've been doing focus groups over the past 18 months or so. We do not actually have little smiley faces on the Zoom screen at the time, but the identities of people in our focus groups are confidentiality is part of that. So that's why we've obscured them for the purposes of this slide. The bottom right is there are focus group facilities that are set up to do this kind of thing. It doesn't need to be this formal. I've also been in a focus group in just like a hotel conference room, for example, for a local company's catalog. But when somebody like RedHat or probably most significant IT companies hold a focus group, it's in one of these facilities by companies that specialize in this kind of thing. So what I'm going to talk about today is 2 of our reports. Our State of Enterprise Open Source report, 2021, which basically means the survey was done in 2020. The 2021 Global Tech Outlook report, sort of the same thing. We have new versions of these reports coming out. I actually need to spend a bunch of time on the Enterprise Open Source report when I get back. That should be going to print in probably about next March. And then I literally just saw the final but not published report for Global Tech Outlook, and that's coming out November 16th. So kind of keep your eyes peeled if you're interested in that kind of thing. Mostly I'm going to be drawing from these. I'm going to give a couple of data points from older surveys, and I will tell you a couple of previews from the Global Tech Outlook report that fit in with some of the data I have here. So this is the first thing. I'm tell you the truth, I couldn't remember why I don't have a number from the past report here. This is from a couple years ago, but this is a very interesting number to us in terms of expected change in software usage, where enterprise open source, meaning commercially supported open source, has actually crossed over proprietary software in the last year or two, and it's increasing pretty rapidly. Community open source, so you download it from the internet, you get support from the community, you support yourself, is also increasing, although not quite as rapidly. I will note, by the way, that this is a survey of about 1,400, both of these are surveys of about 1,400 medium to large enterprises. And I should probably mention that with research in general, if you read a research report, you all look at the demographics. For how many people did they survey? 1,400 is a pretty good number. You definitely would like to see in the hundreds in most cases. And in this case, this is a perspective from enterprises. This is not a perspective from college students, for example. And specifically, these are responses from people who would be potential customers of RedHat, or in many cases who are customers of RedHat. So you get a very different answer if you survey a bunch of students or smaller businesses or something like that. So next question, is how is enterprise open source being used? And the reason I think these numbers are interesting is that you look at all those three things. First of all, IT infrastructure modernization, that has been a top use of enterprise open source forever. But what's interesting is if you look at some of the other data, I think there's a lot of evidence that doesn't mean, we're replacing Unix with Linux. We're replacing WebSphere with JBoss. I mean, there's probably still some of that going on, but frankly, that's mostly been burned through at that point. I think a lot of this has to do with putting in containerized, often Kubernetes-based infrastructures. Now, if you look at, in this case, and this is quite typical, you get a little bit different answers for the different geographical regions. And we always hit that regional breakdown. And frankly, one of the interesting things is they don't tend to vary all that much most of the time. So a lot of the results we get, I'd say most of the results we get in these surveys, there's some variation, but it's mostly a worldwide phenomenon. And to my point on that earlier slide, we see a lot of importance attached to Kubernetes, the cloud native application strategies. And this is what kind of leads us to think that numbers that show infrastructure modernization are not about the old ways of doing infrastructure modernization with open source predominantly, but it's about cloud native containers, Kubernetes, and so forth. This actually is a case where you do have pretty much the expected geographic variation. And you saw this with Linux when it was coming in too. The US, North America more generally, they're the early adopters. EMEA comes after that, mostly, of course, that's mostly Western Europe. And then you have Asia Pacific, particularly historically Japan, but also Singapore and some of the other sort of more developing countries in Asia, India, and you have Latin America sort of taking up the rear. In these surveys, Latin America tends to mean mostly Brazil and Mexico. That's kind of where we see the kind of most interest. And frankly, if that were sort of a broader Latin America, it would be probably trailing a bit more. The other thing we like to do, and it starts to get tricky to do some of these crosstab breakdowns because, we have so many answers for this question and we keep slicing and slicing and slicing. you can suddenly be down to very few answers. And we look at that and go, we really can't conclude anything by that. But we look at the phases of container adoption. Again, this is sort of what we expect, particularly as 5G rollout, telecoms is way up there. Financial services is always way up there in terms of new technology adoption. I think healthcare and retail, probably a bit of a mixed bag, because partly because the survey instrument for this was out in the field kind of after the pandemic hit. And I think you're seeing a mix of new technology being brought in for certain areas, like, for instance, some remote things related to healthcare, for some big web stuff related to retail. And then you have another part of the industry that's in like complete survival mode. So I think you're seeing a little bit of a bifurcation there. I really like this one. So, top benefits of using enterprise open source. And, I love these things: high quality, access to innovation, better security. And then sort of specifically in the enterprise open source angle, the ability to safely leverage open source technologies. And, anybody who's been around open source for a while knows if we asked those questions 10 years ago, much less 20 years ago, you have people questioning security, you have people questioning the quality. They probably wouldn't have brought up innovation at all. What they would have brought up almost certainly is cost. And cost always matters. Oh, I don't care how much it costs, said no CIO ever. And cost actually is on this list. I think it was down around number 6. Another stat that relates to that: 84% said that enterprise open source is a key part of their enterprises or their organization's security strategy. Again, this idea that open source, commercial open source, is important for good security as opposed to something we worry about a lot. I mean, particularly when we had focus groups of smaller enterprises, back when I was starting at RedHat around 10 years or so ago, there would be a lot of, that open source is interesting, but it kind of scares me from a security perspective. And today, to a degree, you see it as a barrier. It's really the same kind of barrier as software is in general. Do you worry about security? I don't care what software you're running, you better be worrying about security. So we're kind of in COVID times here, and what are the funding priorities outside of IT technology products and solutions? So this is kind of outside, maybe primarily the CIO's purview to a broader purview. And digital transformation leads. And, I think digital transformation gets a lot of hype hate at some level, but we actually do focus groups and language studies, and it still connects to IT leaders. And the thing I find encouraging about this is there is a lot of people stuff up there, and I think that's a good thing. Now, are you welcome to be cynical about how much of this prioritization actually ends up with checks being written and people being given time off for training and so forth? I think that's a very reasonable question to ask. And the same thing happens with security. But I like that. And as I say, across a number of categories, so that gives me pretty good confidence that that's kind of a constant, and that particularly different organizations within the larger organization are answering that way. Yeah, and you could argue maybe compliance ought to be higher, but then that's maybe more of an IT funding priority in some ways anyway. Um, and to the point I just made, if we look at the investments in digital transformation, this is from a couple years ago on the global IT trends. We see a bit of a tilt towards technologies, which is certainly what we historically saw. But processes and people are up there too. So we actually are putting the. I think we put this back on for this year, and I think things tilted a little bit more towards processes and people. So, what are your company's top IT funding priorities? And there are a few things I will point out here. Um, IT security, number one. Same caveat about how much money actually gets put in there, even though it's a priority. And I've had this discussion with one of my security colleagues, and you can see some of the other things there. Storage is interestingly pretty low, as is analytics and big data. And you might say, I'd expect that to be higher, and I'm not sure you'd be wrong. But talking to a number of analysts as well, so this gets into the more qualitative side of things, so they do their own surveys, is that the past year and a half or so has kind of been storage sort of a hold the fort sort of thing. So there have been definitely more investments in AI, ML within analytics, but the overall investment in the area, kind of hasn't been as much as in the Hadoop big data days when it was really in a big upward trend. So that seems to be maybe a little bit of a pause right now. Top barriers preventing you from being successful in digital transformation. Integration issues actually went down a bit in this year's survey, which will be coming out shortly. Security compliance, talent gaps. Those are, so again, this is sort of another face to some of the numbers that we've seen. And that's one of the things we try to do in these surveys is ask questions in different ways and come at questions from different angles. And when they seem to be consistent with each other, that gives us definitely more, definitely more sort of confidence that we're probably seeing something that is real. Interesting that budget is so low there, isn't it? Again, this is an angle of we're using digital transformation. And I don't have time in this presentation to go into this in great detail. Check out our new report when it's out, because we actually spend a bit of time in there and have some new angles in this. But basically, one of the things, to give you again a little preview, as companies get further along in their digital transformation, a lot of them start by making it about cost. And by the time they get to the later stages, it's about innovation. Yes. Where I think generally, I don't think we give a definition. And so the question is, what do we mean by compliance? And I think that is very deliberately a very broad anything, data governance. I think we may have a breakdown. I don't know if I have it in this deck, but there's things like data governance. There's things like, risk management, that kind of thing. Yeah, I think, and again, I'm not sure if it's in here, but I think we at some point do break that down, and we have a big appendix of charts in the current presentation, so you may look there. So this is interesting in the context of this. I want to spend a little time in this. I don't know how many of you were in Chris Wright's presentation or in I forget the Google keynote on security today. which I have to say was a total show-off video, I have to say. But anyway, very nicely done. But network security is up there, and that's traditional security, basically, and it's kind of not surprising to see that up there. Cloud security, I can't give you a kind of precise definition of, but it is security related to clouds generally. And you can kind of go down the list there. Threat intelligence, detection, response is always high up there. Automation around compliance is their middle of the road. Third party or supply chain risk management, which we have been talking about here, 10%. Well, okay, you're probably thinking, well, yeah, but this was, the summer before last, we took this survey and people weren't taking that as seriously yet. Exact same number in this year's survey over the past summer. So what's going on there? That is really an excellent question. Here's a couple of theories about it. This is something we're going to dig down deeper into. First of all, is in the Google presentation, there was the comment made that we did an informal survey, and half of the people, whatever, or base whatever. The other half were, oh my God, I don't know what I'm going to do about this. So I think there is some evidence that this hasn't percolated on radar screens yet, or it's on radar screens, but not under that name. Like maybe if we asked them, are you worried about consuming open source libraries in your own software that you write, and the vulnerability management upstream, maybe more people would answer. The other thing I wonder is if the question I remember these are IT leaders, IT decision makers. If they're not thinking so much in terms of their internal app dev, but our open source software that we use, our proprietary software that we use, like RedHat Enterprise Linux. Oh yeah, RedHat takes care of that stuff for us. We don't need to worry about that. Which I think for RedHat Enterprise Linux is a perfectly true statement, but your internal software base is 90% other stuff. So I think this is this is kind of one of the leave behinds. I see Kate shaking her head over there. I think that's really worth digging into. We should not assume that just because Joe Biden put out a directive and told everyone this is really important, and because people like those at this conference get it, that people as a whole do. And I think understanding this gap is really important. How are we doing? Good. Top funding priority. Oh, did I put that in there twice? Yes. Another one I wanted to point out here is, we saw supply chain high up earlier on, but we're not going to actually hire anybody to do the security and compliance stuff. I guess it's just going to happen itself. So that was another kind of sort of result, because, and as you saw earlier, the people type of questions had pretty good answers. So I'm not quite sure why security and compliance staff, doesn't get to partake in this funding that's going elsewhere. Emerging technology, which is sort of near and dear to my heart in terms of what I do. There are basically two things are definitely at the top here. AI/ML, as you can see, is up there. Now, again, remember that's in the context of data analytics, is maybe a bit lower down in spending. But still, I think it's fair to say that's an emerging technology area that IT decision makers are thinking about a lot. really IoT is asked in a couple of different ways. So without kind of going into definitional arguments with my analyst hat on, you have both IoT here and edge computing. And with this year's data, we actually have a slice that we're able to combine who answered one or the other or both and come up with an answer. And that was about 61% if you add those together. There's some ambiguity. I think some people think of IoT as a discrete thing. Some people think of edge as a discrete thing. And some people think of them as combined. And that's, again, something we're going to do some surveying about. Why doesn't AIML work? And it's really spread across a number of different things. Collaboration space, that doesn't surprise me a great deal. Managing AIML tools and frameworks. And again, I think that makes sense. We've done some work with like Open Data Hub, for example, and some cloud services to kind of make that consumption easier. Those are kind of the two big areas that I guess that's about half, maybe it's even a little more than half of the sort of the reasons why AIML work is difficult. This was something we did not do again this year because we thought the result from last year was interesting, but frankly, it took a lot of questions and you only have so many questions in these surveys. Is we asked from a state of enterprise open source, what's your legacy application strategy for the next 24 months? And the interesting thing here isn't that, say, leave as is has the highest number in my view, but it's all over the map. And we're actually changing some of the terminology a little bit in this year's survey, and I'll see what those are in a couple of weeks. But basically, you've got some stuff being re-architected, something for cloud native, others being not as re-architected, some sort of a lighter weight modernization. Some of them, just leave it in place and don't breathe on it type of thing. And then some that are, just, get rid of them and replace it with something else. So I think the takeaway for me there is when you talk about application strategies, most organizations are kind of thinking about their workloads and they're not doing everything, they're not moving everything to Kubernetes. Kubernetes may be very important for new applications, new workloads, but it's not for everything. This was the unexpected result from last enterprise open source report. And we did a deeper dive this year. We'll see what results are. This was kind of one question, one report. But Kelly Andrews, as I said, runs our brand insights group, and kind of talk. Basically, every year when we do this survey, it's like, okay, here's a bunch of questions we really want to keep tracking from year to year, so that we can see similarities, differences, changes, etc. And that takes up a chunk. There's some others that we sort of go, this hasn't budged in a few years. It's not very interesting, or we don't know how to interpret the results really the way the question is asked. So let's get rid of this thing. And then we ask some new things. And for example, this year we dove down into security a little bit more. So last year, I think one of the things that we've long wondered in open source, and I'm sure we've done some surveying around this, but we certainly hadn't done any recently, and nothing that jumped out was, many companies at this conference contribute a lot to open source, and there's all kinds of benefits, quite frankly, to us and our customers in terms of doing that open source development model, and that's, and that's great. But do companies, do people buy from us really care? They just want, they just care that we get our product. Do they really understand what the benefit of the open source development model is? And we were frankly completely shocked. I was completely shocked. 83% were more likely to select a vendor who contributes to the open source community. And one of our questions this year, and just repeating that question, is sort of, if so, why? And we have a lot of theories, but we're interested. How much of this is about self-interest? How much of it is about kind of self-sustaining open source development models and the like? And we'll see what the answers this year look like. I certainly hope the overall number is as high. And this is a quote from Dr. Lisa Costa in the DoD. And basically, this is a great quote. It's about partnership. The open source community is absolutely critical, as well as our other government teammates. And we all take advantage of what they've already learned and want to share what we've learned, which I think is a really, really nice testimony from Dr. Costa. So with that, I think that's a high note to end on.